Thoughts on how should we better prepare citizens for climate change, and what are some of the key components of the environmental education piece in terms of preparing citizens for climate change. People talk about resilience, people talk of many other science-based aspects. So what are your key components there?
On the plus side, though, it's thinking about where we were when I first started this work and where we are now. I see hundreds more people involved, thousands more people involved. I see a lot more people working hard. There's a lot more research published than there ever was before. It's become very much more complex, complicated. There are a lot of people thinking about environmental education, thinking about issues like climate change, and I think that there's a couple of ways of looking at that in a positive light. One is perhaps with so many voices of expressing care and concern, we're creating a greater context for perhaps making a breakthrough. And there's just a lot of individual teachers out there doing their very best to try and create openings for their students, their children, their learners to see the world in a little bit different ways. And so I think those things are incredibly positive and hopeful. The one thing I do like about environmental education, and it's maybe the only real thing, is that I think by using environmental as an adjective, it's drawing our attention, I think, to something that's missing, fundamentally missing in education. It's drawing our attention to something. Environment may not be the best word. I love the influx of some of the other words that people are using these days: place-based or nature-based or forest school. There's a lot of people now trying to get back to realizing that there's something that more in the real world that needs to be included. And so I think environment it's a word that I think is disruptive. It's not maybe disruptive in all the ways that it needs to be, and that would be my concern about it. But it's a disruptive word. When people start talking about environmental concerns, the status quo gets anxious, and so in that very way, I think that's not bad. So while pedagogies, I suppose, I think one of the things that unites the wild part of it and the pedagogy part of it is concern about issues of control. How is it that education is controlled in ways that it tends to so often bend us back in directions of the status quo? And why is it so hard to see that and make changes? So the first and foremost, there's some epistemological questions there about the limited. In what ways is the range of knowledge that's available for our students narrowed in a way that it doesn't that we miss out on a lot. And so we think about how the way curriculum is developed. It's defined by fairly limited range of objectives. It tends to be highly for the most part. I know there's some lovely teachers out there that are doing fantastic things to work against this next point, but it's when it comes right down to it, the curriculum is rooted in a lot of abstraction. In many cases, it denies human physicality and the fact and the learning that accrues through doing things actually in a real world. There's one colleague of mine that once talked about the physicality of humans, and he said that when we take very young children and we put them into classrooms, we're denying their physicality. And he said, isn't that a bit like breaking horses? curriculum is controlled in such a way that it puts those things to the margins. And so that would be one idea of wilding curriculum, would be to try and make a little room for more uncontrolled, undefined, more expressive learning. I like the years ago, Elliot Eisner coined this term, expressive learning. And for him, it was the idea that we create good learning opportunities with good content, and students will make different meanings out of that, and they will express themselves through those experiences in ways that defy concrete or limited learning outcomes and objectives. We'll interact with that. We can interact with our world in much more expressive ways that release people's imaginations rather than constrict them. So that's one thing, to be ever more conscious of the ways that we are bending back in the direction of a more narrow set of possibilities for education. Education wouldn't be about a particular end. It would be about the development of human beings that were more capable, had the emotional and the cognitive and the emotional range to be able to better handle these kind of complex questions that we're coming up against just now.
That work is important, but it only becomes even more important when you move to the international dimension. And so under the UN process, they've tried to organize this some, but the practitioners who are doing exactly what we're talking about are all over the world. And we in the United States are doing some amazing, important work, but that doesn't mean that the solution to any one program comes from within the United States. It could come from Sri Lanka, it could come from Indonesia, it could come from Kenya. And so building stronger international and domestic collaborations at a community scale, at a national scale, and an international scale is a critical priority. We are right now finishing up the Doha Work Program under the United Nations process and reviewing it and looking at recommendations for the future. And one of the recommendations I'm putting forth is that deepening the network structures and architectures for collaboration under the Article 6 principle is a really, really important element, right? Because if we don't know, a practice could emerge as really effective and it is transferable, but is not transferred because there isn't any mechanism to transfer it. And relying on nation states to do that process is very, very complicated.
Innovative approaches to building climate literacy. Having a base knowledge is really important. And whether it's a teacher in a classroom or peer-to-peer learning, which I think is very, very effective and should be encouraged, it's important that people understand the basics of the climate system. You don't have to be a climate scientist, you don't have to be a renewable energy expert, but it is critical that there's some basic understanding of the dynamics involved. And that's one of the reasons we developed the climate literacy framework 10 years ago, which the CLEAN network is based on. And the sort of guiding principle of the CLEAN framework, the climate literacy framework, is that people can take action to reduce the impact of climate change. And then within that, there's a number of key concepts that are sort of embedded under that. And so once people have that basic understanding, then they can be creative in their own ways. I think that this is something that teachers have struggled with, that oftentimes they don't have the background themselves. They go off on the internet and there's so much contradictory information. I've seen for many years teachers get confused themselves because they never learned about it themselves. They never learned the basics in their own professional development training.
Right.
And certainly over the years, we've tried to make that a priority of having effective workshops for teachers, but we've only been able to reach so many teachers because there's only so much funding.
Part of the challenge with climate change is that it's a global phenomenon with very local impacts. So given that, how should the education community be teaching climate change, given that there's complexity at the global, local level? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I think that the good thing about climate and energy and sustainable practices is that they are completely interdisciplinary and completely integrating.
Mm.
So we could teach every topic, maybe with a few exceptions. Physical education might be hard to teach about climate change, but I'm sure some creative instructors will be able to figure out a way to do that. And in fact, back in the late 1980s, there was an effort at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories in California to do just that. They had summer workshops for teachers to develop climate change education across the curriculum, including physical education and language and reading and mathematics and so forth. And unfortunately, that effort never came to fruition. But there are so many opportunities for infusing climate and climate science, climate solutions, and all the related sustainable practices and understanding of energy in our lives that should be central to all education around the world.
When I mean education, I'm talking about education, training, public outreach, public participation, the whole aspects, all the dimensions of it are crucial to what nations, communities are doing to address climate change effectively. Just education alone is a very large set of organizations and institutions. Whether you're talking about universities, colleges, pre-college, community college, K-12, formal, informal, non-formal, place-based, it's massive. My estimation is that just in the United States alone, we're talking about north of a $2 trillion enterprise that interacts with almost every person in the country on an annual basis. And then through media and communications and other modalities and outreach and web, it's a very significant, sizable organization. How education works in how humans are responding to climate change, the last number of years we've dug into this, and what we have found is while it was in the original treaty that it should be there in all its forms, it hasn't really been seriously explored as a capability or a pillar of what supports actions in communities. It's kind of a nice thing, but it's not really central. Well, our analysis shows that it is actually central. If you're going to change everything as a result of addressing climate change, food, agriculture, transportation, energy production, land use, that's what has to change in order to address climate change. You cannot do that without education. It's impossible. I think that education about climate change is a natural emergent property that shows up with educators. You talk to any educator, what are they're focused on is building skill and knowledge and abilities for future generations. That's what they're about. And so when you start looking at these large issues that are showing up in the landscape of the future, it naturally calls education of all forms into focusing on this issue. And so, that has shown up over time. And I think that, while communication is a very powerful tool, what's happening now with learners is that they're wanting to go from, I understand a problem enough, to now I really want to build skill to address the problem in all its forms. And so, that is one of the really interesting properties of this current work, is that people are moving from problem to solution very fast.
Is there a new trend? So because if you take any sustainable development problem, it has so many different dimensions. It has a social dimension, it has economic dimension, it has a peace, justice dimension, environment dimension. Have you seen that kind of a trend that is emerging, where you take up any issue, but it goes beyond the dimensions of courses? So
Yeah.
how should we lead to, so where is environmental education going? Is it becoming much more of a sustainable development issue where we are not just dealing with science education, but also different aspects of environment and its challenges?
But I would even extend that further, right? Because it's the what we're looking at is much bigger than environment,
Mm-hmm.
because it is a natural security issue, it is a jobs issue, it is a public health issue, it is a economy issue, it is an equity issue. It, you know, just keep on going down the list.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it is much bigger than environmental education. While environmental education does show us some early work on how to do transdisciplinary education. I think, you know, there are many fields that naturally have gone transdisciplinary for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the work of the environmental education, they naturally always knew they needed to go transdisciplinary. But now when you're dealing with national security or business, so you have business majors at
Yes.
Columbia, I'm assuming.
Yes.
And so I would imagine that the business majors need to take much more coursework in, say, climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't understand the carbon cycle and exactly how it works and how you can quantify, because one of the largest issues that many sectors are going to have to deal with is how do they figure out how to decarbonize their sector? It's not just science. It's much bigger than that. It requires multiple dimensions to coherently, that's part of the coherence idea, is that it has to have multiple dimensions. History, critically important. How did we get to here? Well, why did humanity do what it did? And how has it moving forward? What can we learn from the past about addressing these issues about going forward? History has a huge role. Social sciences, civics, economics, math, you know, just keep on going. I don't think there's a single human educational discipline that
Mm-hmm.
does not have something to bear on this issue. But what we do know is that if we don't intentionally bring them together for our learners and students, they're going to isolate knowledge and skills and not see how they work together effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Learning theory is very clear on these points, right? Coherence is so important, but unless you put a skill in a new instance, it doesn't naturally transfer across. And so you'll think it's just for this situation as opposed to it transfers across. So transdisciplinary learning, critically important. Time is critically important.
I think an interesting case study would be Greta Thunberg, who describes how she learned about climate change in school, and she learned how it's a very serious problem that kind of it boggled her mind and made her quite depressed for a while. That if it's such a serious problem, why is nobody taking it seriously? And then from there, she was able to take some actions, and she had some agency, and has been able to communicate both in terms of having speeches, but also using social media as part of her outreach efforts to inspire and motivate people. So that's one example of how a single person who is informed and understands what the science has to say is able to then use her own agency and the tools available to her, the opportunities available to her, to have a massive influence on, you know, on the world, really. It's quite a interesting kind of nonlinear situation, since there's so many nonlinear factors involved with the climate conundrum. In a way, the solution is to find nonlinear ways, which we can't always predict how it's going to work. But a couple of years ago, I was involved with a workshop looking at social tipping points for climate action. It was an outcome from that workshop from 3 years ago, published in the journal PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And education is actually one of those social tipping points. Education and engagement that when it's properly harnessed, it can help to inform and inspire people to take action. as the example of Greta Thunberg shows, you know, we have maybe more agency than we think, more ability to act and have an impact. You know, Greta says that we haven't been able to reduce emissions in the couple of years that she's been doing her climate strikes. But if this doesn't, this revitalization of the climate movement that she's helped spark doesn't make an impact, then I'm not sure anything will.
One other important point there is what also makes this time different is we saw this when we were working under the White House very strongly in the last administration was youth. Youth engagement, youth leadership, youth activism. But the activism is interesting, right? Because it's not just, you know, protests and on the street. If you just think it's that, you've missed what's going on. They're going into careful deliberations with community leaders of all forms and really calling for a new agenda and willing to roll up their sleeves and work to make that agenda happen, because it's a whole set of new capacities that these are new skills that aren't really prevalent in communities right now.
You mentioned SDG 4 and specifically SDG 4.7, which talks about global citizenship.
Yeah.
How is that target going to help or not help in the zero emission for by 2050? Do you think that there are some aspects of education that and under the SDGs, maybe goal 4 is still very separate from climate change and climate related discussions, or do you see that there is a convergence at the local level, international level, and especially with your work? Do you see that the goals are coming together, or are we still living in the MDG era where everything was so separate and we were all siloed?
Can't have silos. We don't have time for that. SDG 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And SDG, you know, target, you know, under the SDG indicators initiative has targets for the objective 13.3. And it totally relates to education. But then there's also, if you think about, you know, SDG 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. 11, make cities and human settlements safe, inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 4, ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education, promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. 2, end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. And 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Those are all nested together. They're completely nested together, and operating without them nested together is going to miss the point. So we're looking at 7 SDGs.
But 7 SDGs is education bringing all of them together, or are we saying that we are speaking a different language? I want to know that.
Yeah, sure. So what I say is goal 1, 2, 4, 11, 12, 13, and 17 together operate a framework for what we do. You know, it's 7 of the 17. It's not that the other ones aren't related, they're just less directly related. And so if you're, I mean, over the last 14 years in the United States, the focus on an equitable and just transition to a low carbon and resilient future, that's new language, right? Because you can't propagate inequities as you change everything, right? So that brings in a different dimension to, I don't remember which SDG it was, it might be 11 or 12, but you know, you're working at a city and community scale, that's a different SDG. Your SDG 17, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. And that's more about partnerships and strategies of those partnerships, right? So that's, you're starting to see, like, you know, some of them are mechanistic and some of them are showing that this is a problem and a set of solutions that have to happen together in order for it to really work comprehensively. You can't just focus on one piece, SDG 13 in my case, or SDG 4. We started at 4 and 13, but then you start looking carefully and you see that there are actually a wider set of SDGs that relate to each other. But I think at the bottom, this work that's happening in communities in the United States, I don't think is unique, is that you have to unite them, but you can't use the language of SDGs in the work, but at the same time, as signatory countries to the SDG goals, and the United States is one of those, we must be able to do the work using the language of community and the work and of the community, for the community, by the community, but be able to translate it backward for reporting. And it also gives the ability to see, oh, I'm really working on something in SDG 4. I need to see who's doing work in the United States on 4, but the reason they're doing it is not 4. So there's like coding that says that is really SDG 4. I know you don't come from that. I know you don't use that, but somebody has to identify it, tag it, connect it to SDG 4 and related goals in order for people to see it when they're looking for SDG 4. So that's just the nature of the work, right? These are big, complicated human endeavors. But again, I just want to emphasize that the reason why we are doing these things is not because the UN asked us to do it, but the UN allows us the ability to collaborate and share practice internationally if we have a unifying framework that we translate our work into.
RNS used to say the frontier is long and there's lots of work to do. So, but how do we, what do we actually do educationally to make this stuff work? And that's my concern. It's not so much trying to focus on human rights or gender equality or global citizenship, but what's really missing that keeps us from making any progress on these things. And I think that when we start looking at those kinds of questions, then maybe some of the other stuff will fall into, well, I'd like to think that it will fall into place, but we know how terribly hard change is. Quite a few years ago, I had the opportunity to do a series of interviews with Arne Næss, the Norwegian philosopher, the fellow that coined the term deep ecology. One of the things that's always struck me that he said was, he said, you know, we've got more than enough science to know that we need to change our ways, but we don't. And so that was always brought me back to the kind of question, why don't people care? And is there something that's missing in the kind of education that's generally presented, kind of a globalized or Western, or, you know, there's a number of descriptors for it, but a globalized education? What's missing, really? So that's a first piece. And what's holding us back? And so this business of what is required in order for people to actually care seems to be a fairly important question. It's tied in with things like ethics, and it's tied in, I suppose it's tied in with psychological dimensions, so I'm not an expert in that.
What are the common misses in the current climate education approaches? Do you think that there are certain gaps that you see?
Yeah.
And why is it that we don't get real traction for change? And so I think that is, that's a pretty fundamental question. So we might ask of environmental education, have our efforts up till now, collectively, not isolating individuals, have they done more to reinforce the status quo, or have they done more to disrupt it? And I think we would need to ask the same question of education for sustainable development. Does this do more to this concept as a guiding light, I guess? Does it do more to reinforce the status quo, or does it really have the potential to seriously disrupt it? And in both cases, I think we need to do more. Now, on what really is missing in education? What are we doing so fundamentally incorrectly that we can't address issues like climate change more effectively with education? If you can't measure it, it just doesn't count in a globalized kind of curriculum.
Speaking to the teachers and the school system a little bit, do you see any gaps whether it's in sense, you mentioned kind of the training gap and the knowledge gap that the teachers might face. In terms of the urgency, feeling the urgency of educating their students or having their school prioritize climate solution and the discussions, educational discussions around climate change, do you see any gaps in the formal education community, especially at the leadership level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm most familiar with the United States, which of course historically is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And in some ways the most challenging, because we have an education system in the US that is very locally driven. There is no Ministry of Education. Even the Department of Education has very little, almost no influence on the curriculum. It's all done at a state level and often at a district level. The same is true in Germany and some other countries. But so in countries where they do have that top-down Ministry of Education, in some ways they have the advantage of being able to sort of dictate, as has happened in Italy recently, that everybody's going to learn about climate change starting in kindergarten all the way through. And I think Ghana has done the same thing. And I think that's definitely a trend for those types of countries that have ministries of education that dictate the curriculum. But that's certainly not true in a lot of the world. And, you know, I was just looking at the 5 largest countries in the world. They're all part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They're all doing some interesting work on climate change. You know, between those 5 largest countries in the world, that's more than half the emissions and almost half the population of the planet. And yet they have not been participating in any kind of robust way in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change education initiatives. So they are, even though like in the United States and in China and India, there is some good work going on, there is no effort to sort of methodically support that, methodically monitor and evaluate what's happening. That's a huge, huge missed opportunity. There's a bit of a kind of a dilemma and paradox in education as it's currently structured, which is that the more educated people are, the more their carbon footprint rises. So in other words, there's some strong research now that shows that you know, secondary education and above means that you're going to have a bigger impact on the planet in terms of planetary boundaries, not just climate change, but just through increased consumption, increased travel, and so forth. So this is a conundrum. It's a real paradox. How do we solve this problem? And it means that it basically means that education has to be completely transformed. The localization of pedagogy, maybe I can say it in those terms, which I think is imperative. It's crucial that people understand that the big picture of, and even just the understanding of the greenhouse effect and how it's a natural phenomenon, but human beings are impacting this natural dynamic that helps keep the earth warm enough so it's not a frozen snowball. But we're unfortunately altering it because we're burning these buried solar energy in the form of fossil fuels, which is warming the planet in ways that have massive consequences and impacts. But as you say, the impacts are local, and the local context is so important, and especially for younger people. You know, overwhelming them with too much information about the direness of the situation can certainly be counterproductive. And I think, you know, as Greta herself has said, she went into a deep depression when she learned at the age of 11 or 12 about climate change. But on the other hand, you know, she was able to emerge from that empowered. But you know, not everybody has that kind of resilience that she's shown. But I think now, yes, we need to keep our eyes focused on these global issues, but it also, in terms of adaptation and transforming our communities at a local level, that's really where the action is. Those are all very noble goals, and they're in some ways it's like a laundry list of noble goals, and there's no problem with that. But the most important aspect, which is that we take informed climate action, is completely missing from there. Yes, there is an SDG about climate action, but education is not in there. So, in my view, SDG 4.7 is weak in terms of actually being able to address this problem. And from what I've seen, there's some really well-intentioned efforts to teach the SDGs, but from what I've seen, it's approached in kind of a piecemeal smorgasbord fashion of, I'll take a little of this and I'll do a little of that, and once again we're in this dilemma where climate change ends up missing because people are uncomfortable with it, or it's complicated, or I just don't want to think about it anymore. So I guess that's how I feel about it. The funding is a huge barrier, and even in the negotiations, people will say, "Oh yeah, education. Yeah, we need to have that as a bullet point." But where's the funding for that?
Students are frustrated. Learners, let's use learners, because all education does not happen in a formal context. In fact, that's one of the biggest areas where we need to make progress is, coherence. Relevance, we've got relevance. The relevance of this issue is massive. However, the coherence is not. And so learning happens in many places a long time. And so one of the things that students are, and I would imagine this is true for learners, is they're not getting enough time on this. And they feel completely blindsided because this is the first time that they have finally understood this issue deeply, because it's a class only on climate change. It's not like a unit in 7th grade for a week and that really kind of like you can gloss over it, really not understand it and move on. So they feel like I should have known this much earlier. This is really important. I'm surprised that nobody gave this to me earlier. And it takes a much longer amount of time to really deeply understand all the dimensions of this work. It's massive. And so, what's critical and what happens from kindergarten that is age appropriate all the way through, formal education to higher education, to lifelong learning, to community-based learning, time is one of the most important pieces, and we must dedicate ourselves across any modality of education to putting appropriate amounts of time for our learners and our students, because it takes time, and it's so important for the future of what we're trying to do as humanity. It needs to be inclusive and equitable, because there's a lot of this that is what we're talking about that is not happening for everyone. Everyone has a right to know and understand this work deeply so that they can bring their talents, their capabilities, and service to their communities to the maximal effect.
Thank you so much, Frank. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.